Hello, this is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art. In this episode, we'll be making an Estuary charcuterie board using live edge walnut and copper resin. We will also be cutting out and shaping a wood handle and finishing it with food grade oil. So let's get started. The plan is to burn in random rivers along the top surface, but also have them flow down the live edges, creating infinity fractal waterfalls. When creating the waterfalls, you're going to have to sand the live edges quite a bit in the finishing process, so I went ahead and prepped them ahead of time. Using water and high voltage electricity, I burned the rivers in, but they are completely random and there isn't much surface to work with on this small charcuterie board. I have an overall idea how I'd like the rivers to flow across the surface, so I apply water to mainly just those areas and then hope for the best. In the end, the electricity will burn where it wants to, taking the path of least resistance, and it can be very uncooperative at times. I only get one shot at this unless I want to start over with a new slab, so I do my best and hope that works out. Instead of fighting and trying to control the electricity, I embrace that it's going to be random, knowing that I'm going to get a unique system of rivers every single time. I continue burning until I'm satisfied with the depth and width of the rivers. Once finished and the slab dries out, then I can start removing the charred debris from the rivers. Using a nylon wheel brush and vacuum, I can remove as much or as little debris as I'd like for the desired look. For this piece, I decided to remove just about all of the debris, so there are clear and distinct charred lines along the riverbanks. Otherwise, you can play around with how much debris to leave in, which changes the look and feel of the rivers in contrast to the finished walnut. One side effect of the burning process is staining on the top surface of the wood. Depending on the size of the slab, I can either run it through the drum sander, use the routing surface table, or in this case, use a direct drive sander to remove that surface. After sanding, you get a glimpse of what the river is going to look like once completed. I've made several copper resin pieces in the past, and there are several options for coloring that you can choose from. The client requested that the resin be a rustic copper, so I used a combination of mica powders from Black Diamond Pigments. Starting with Liberty Copper, I added in everything from mahogany, bronze, to 24 karat gold to get that rustic base. I also mixed up separately some auxiliary colors that we'll use later. Starting with the base mix, I go ahead and fill up the majority of the river system, including the waterfalls on the live edges. Even though we thoroughly blended up over 9 separate colors to get this base rustic copper, you can see some of the darker and lighter colors separating during the pour process. This will help add depth to the resin art, giving the illusion of a flowing river. I make sure to pour into all the rivers and the waterfalls, but I leave a little bit of room because we're going to add the secondary auxiliary colors next. If I fill them up too much, then a lot of the resin art will get surfaced off during the finishing process. The auxiliary colors that I'm adding in next are just variations of that rustic copper base. One is lighter and one is darker, and that just adds to the resin art, which contributes to giving the rivers its flow or movement. I gently mix them together until I'm satisfied with the resin art. I've left in about 1/8 of an inch of clearance between the top of the resin and the top of the walnut. This is so I can come back and pour clear epoxy over the entire river system that will help protect the resin art during the finishing and surfacing process. Depending on the manufacturer and the type of resin, it could take hours, days, or weeks for the epoxy to fully cure. It's very important to follow the guidelines of each manufacturer and allow the resin to fully cure before surfacing. Otherwise, you can get severe tear out, which will essentially ruin your project. After removing the barriers on the waterfalls, we run it through the drum sander. I made sure to surface the top and bottom before the burn process using the router surfacing table, but by running it through the drum sander, you're hitting those surfaces again to make sure it's completely flat. By this point, it's now sanded down to 120 grit and ready for hand sanders. I follow up with 80 grit on a direct drive, hitting the waterfalls. Before getting too far along in the sanding process, we start cutting out the wood handle. Using a scroll saw with a coarse blade, we're able to cut through the 1.5 inch thick walnut with maybe 2 or 3 blades breaking along the way. It's a small price to pay to get a good clean cut without having a CNC machine. After smoothing out some of the rougher areas by hand, we use a router to put a 1/4 inch bevel on both top and bottom of the handle. Next up is to trim off the end using a fine-tooth blade on the miter saw. Going slow and steady during the cut will ensure that you don't have any chip outs on the epoxy. I also replace this blade routinely to get a nice clean cut every time. After sanding up to 400 grit with the palm sanders, I raise the grain using water. This is where I start getting excited again because it gives you a window into what the finished product is going to look like. After the water has dried, I go back and hit all surfaces again with 400 grit and getting ready for the final finish. Because this is a functional charcuterie board and the client plans on serving food with it, we used a food grade oil as the finish. We pretty much drown the wood in the food grade oil, allowing it to absorb as much as possible. We also made sure to use a food grade resin, which is not the case for every manufacturer or type of epoxy, so be sure to check that before starting. Once we're finished applying the first coat of food grade oil, we'll go back and wet sand the epoxy all the way up to 12,000 grit. This essentially will leave a high gloss finish on the resin, but a matte finish on the wood, which gives it that great contrast between the two. This type of finish is optional for each client. Sometimes they do choose to go with the matte finish if they plan on using the charcuterie board quite a bit. The high gloss resin is more prone to surface scratches, but it is my personal favorite and what the majority of my clients do choose to go with. In the end, we didn't have any hiccups and everything worked out the way it was supposed to. I've made many different pieces with a variety of colors, but I do like how the copper and dark walnut turned out. The client was very happy with the results, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on this copper walnut combo. I look forward to seeing your comments or any questions that you have about making this piece. My name is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel @Jeremy Elkins for future videos.